Now, in my youth, I had dedicated my life to following Christ, and for the most part, I was fairly serious. Yet it was in my late 20s and early 30s when I went through a long period of seriously questioning and doubting my Christian faith, which ultimately resulted in me ditching God altogether and briefly becoming an atheist in my mid-30s.
He says that he spent time doubting his faith, but who wants to guess that this was not inspired by a moment of rational skepticism, but rather by a bit of an emotional crisis? To be fair, he doesn't say, but I'd still put down money against logic being the cause of his deconversion. Let's do this. Greetings, fellow space travelers, BionicDance here. So once again we're dealing with the 1-minute preacher who makes 6-minute videos, but whatever. He's going to explain some reasons for his spiritual journey, and they're quite extremely misguided, though not in a way that should really surprise anybody who has studied religious reasoning, if it can even be called that.
And why would I become an atheist? And yet a few people, I think, ask a more interesting question. What made me come back?
Like I said, he doesn't tell us why he briefly became an atheist. I'd like to know.
You see, here's the thing. After becoming an atheist, I quickly realized that both the belief in God and the belief that he doesn't exist.
One of these days, people are going to start getting this right. I hope. While believing a God doesn't exist is certainly part of atheism, if the number of gods you believe in is 0 for any reason and to any intensity, then you are an atheist. No definitive statement is necessary. Much like being a theist, the question is about belief or its absence, not making declarative statements about a God's existence.
Well, they both have their knowledge gaps, their ethical dilemmas, their moral catch-22s, which at the end of the day, they all require some sort of leap of faith.
That's only the case when one takes a very narrow view of what atheism is, yet a wide view of the topics atheism is supposed to tackle, and don't realize that most atheists are logical skeptics who are willing to say, I don't know, when an unsolved problem comes up, followed almost immediately with, let's find out. This is in stark contrast to theists who plug in God whenever an answer isn't immediately apparent. Atheists also don't expect non-belief to cover moral or ethical issues. Atheism doesn't come with those as a package deal the way theism does. Yet you'll often find, as with here, theists expecting that to be so.
And this was very unsettling for me because I think, like the vast majority of atheists, especially your aggressive internet types, although I would have acknowledged that atheism didn't have all the answers, yet essentially all that did remain were a few T's that needed to be crossed and a few I's to be dotted. It was religion that had all the problems.
Again, that depends on what you mean by problems. Religion makes unsupported claims which require faith, and atheists simply don't accept them. Granted, a lot of atheists put much confidence in science and logic, but unlike religion, none of that comes with threats of eternal torture for non-belief. None of it comes with rigid, unchangeable claims about the nature of the universe. Science is open to change based on new data, but try to show a theist the evidence that there never was a global flood, and you'll get a variety of replies that all amount to one form or another of nah-uh. Dogma versus discovery. We see which one this fellow chose. Which would you?
I only thought that way because I had only seriously questioned my Christian faith. I had never put my atheism under the same intense scrutiny. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. Suppose a child is born with, say, cerebral palsy. The atheist would rightly ask, well, if the Christian God exists, who is supposed to be both good and loving, then answer that one, buddy. And it's an emotionally compelling argument with no easy rebuttals. All that I can say is that while I don't know the why, I do know, though, that from a biblical point of view, that God loves that child no less than a healthy one.
This comes with a lot of assumptions. That God exists, that God loves everybody the same amount, that despite this, God somehow lets kids become unhealthy in the first place, and that God didn't use his powers to fix the problem. That God loves us all is not a logical answer to this issue. It's something one says to oneself for comfort when life is shitty.
Now, obviously, many would consider that not to be a very satisfactory response.
And the award for the most obvious statement of the day goes to... envelope, please.
It doesn't answer what we would consider to be the most important question of why. As a result, Many simply leave it at that and assume that atheism is a better alternative.
One of the reasons I suspect that this guy's flirtation with unbelief was emotional rather than logical. It wouldn't shock me if it followed the death of a loved one or some similar tragedy. You know, like one of those Christian films where the atheist is really a believer, they're just bitter because God fucked them over somehow. I hope he watches this video and can tell me whether I'm warm or cold on this one. Thing is, when considering the problem of divine absence and lack of compassion, a logical person wouldn't be thinking that atheism is a better alternative. They wouldn't be thinking of atheism at all. They'd just realize that Christianity is making bullshit claims about the nature of its deity and thus doubting its existence. Funny thing though, someone who rejects Christianity might not go the atheism route. They may well decide that a religion with a less sunshine and rainbows picture of its God has it right instead. Perhaps not quite as logical as having no God belief at all, but it's certainly a possibility.
The suffering child, it's just not a moral dilemma for the Christian.
Well, it should be.
I would argue that it's even more so for the atheist. For if the burden of proof is upon the Christian to prove that God can still exist in spite of the suffering child, then the burden of proof is upon the atheist to prove that that child has a right to exist, even if God doesn't exist.
The atheist doesn't have that burden of proof at all, because atheism doesn't come with that assumption attached. Any claim an atheist may make about that child's right to exist will come from a completely different place in their thinking. See, unlike a theist, atheism isn't a religion. It doesn't dictate with dogma. It's not a lifestyle the way religions tend to be. It describes something we're not, rather than something we are. When an atheist puts forward an argument about something, they're probably not doing it in the name of atheism any more than, say, a Green Bay Packers fan is arguing in the name of football, unless that's the topic. That is a football team, right? I'm not sports people. Frankly, I don't think that any of us has the right to exist, not in the religious sense. I don't think that there are any inherent rights at all. There is only that with which we can get other people to agree, and we call those rights. And we call them that because we feel awfully strongly about them.
If nature is all that there is, then what should become of that genetically defective child?
Should? Who says that there's a should at all in nature? We know what probably will happen to that damaged offspring. Natural selection will see to that. But it's not dictated by anything. It's not mandated. It's not a rule, not the way that religion makes rules. At most, it's a property of nature. It's definitely not a decree.
Like Jesus, does Mother Nature say that how you treat the most vulnerable is how you treat her?
Mother Nature doesn't say anything at all. Mother Nature doesn't exist, and anthropomorphizing natural processes into some sort of creature, much has been done with gods throughout human history, is tainting his thinking, distorting his view of atheism and atheists. How can we have a rational discussion with someone who thinks that atheists worship a nature goddess?
Infanticide, the killing of genetically defective offspring, is widespread throughout nature. Birds toss out the weak from the nest to die. The runt in a litter of pigs is ignored until it starves to death.
And if he's right, that's his God's doing. It's not like these events are some big ol' exception, that when something unpleasant happens in nature, Christians get to decide that it's not their God's fault.
So if humans are but a mere extension of the natural world, then who says we're to operate on a completely different value system from nature's?
We're not. We're part of nature. Our value system comes from nature. It's mostly self-defense. We want to live, preferably pain and hunger free, and we'll do what it takes to achieve that, just like every other creature in the world. So we happen to care for damaged offspring rather than heartlessly kick them out. Humans are a communal species. It makes perfect sense. Also, it's not just humans that care for their damaged young. Try to tell me chimps aren't part of nature. Go on. I'm waiting.
Both the belief in God and the belief that he doesn't exist have their moral catch-22s, which, at the end of the day, require some sort of leap of faith.
Only if you don't understand what it means to be an atheist and don't understand nature. Theism has all of the logical problems and lack of evidence, while atheists just have to protect themselves from a world that's trying to kill them and people who are often selfish and or cruel, and which has no inherent rules. That stinks, but how much we like something has no effect on how real or true it might be. Like how this video is ending and you folks are going to have to wait for your next helping of my glorious presence in your lives. Until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please think.
You know, Dewey, we wouldn't have to do this if I had more Patreon patrons. Just saying.